Sorry for the delay. Thank you for coming. And welcome to the panel about the new generation coming on the club scene and on the experimental music scene. And this panel will focus on the so-called Generation Z. And unfortunately, two of the guests are, or a moderator and a guest are joining us online. So it's kind of like an IRL, URL talk, which wasn't planned. I'd like to welcome our guests. And also we have our moderator, Whitney Wei, who's joining us online. And Whitney is the editor-in-chief of Resident Advisor, and she's also a journalist and a critic focusing on club culture and music scenes, experimental music scenes, writing for the Pitchfork, Guardian, or the Vogue US and others. And we have guests who are here, and then one guest is also joining us online. So please, come. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to have all of you in attendance. It's very unfortunate that I can't be there on site, but I'm definitely hoping that we'll make the most of it. Even though I have COVID, I will, hopefully we'll have a really engaging discussion around Gen Z. So I feel like we should start off with first going around and really having everyone introduce themselves. First of all, state your name and your pronouns and how you are connected to club culture. So that way the audiences can really know that as you're part of Gen Z, you're also contributing to these experimental music scenes and which ways you're doing so. So let's start with Altay, because you're also sequestered at home. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Altay. I'm from Turkey. My pronouns are he, him. I've just recently moved to Berlin like a week ago, but I have lived in Hungary before that for 6 years. And that was my introduction to the club culture and also the experimental music scene. I've started making events in the now closed LARM that has been operating since 2016 to 2021. And afterwards, before the pandemic, I have started a warehouse venue with 3 of my friends. And after COVID, we have opened a pop-up venue as well. So that's kind of my relation to the scene. And I would say like my biggest knowledge would be this Eastern European city of Budapest.
Thank you so much. And Eugene?
Yeah, I'm Eugene. I'm a designer. My pronouns are he, him, and my connection to club culture really stems from the internet and like growing up, sort of putting on parties with friends in London. And I guess more recently, more professionally, my work in club culture has been with the DJ and musician Peggy Goo, who I've been doing design and art direction work for over the last, I would say, three and a bit years. And now I'm the co-founder of a project called Lychee, where we're developing hardware that is adjacent or involved with DJ culture and music.
Thank you. And Hussein, perhaps you can introduce yourself next.
I'm Hussein. I'm Egyptian Palestinian. I go by he, him, I guess. How I got like inspired, or like how I got into like the club culture. I basically, when I was like 16 years old, I started listening to like Aphex Twin, and basically like when I turned 19, I started going out to this party in Dubai It's called Bad House Party. There was like no such a thing as like experimental club music or anything that has to do anything with club music in Dubai. And yeah, so then I turned 21, and I basically there was like this party going on in Dubai. It's called like Karak Beats, and this was basically my introduction to like club music. And now I developed like how like I make music when now I'm being 26. And since the pandemic, when I was, am I talking too much?
No, don't worry.
Not at all. Not
Yeah,
at
because
all.
You're good.
because I actually don't realize when I'm talking too much, and like also like I have to be fair, I'm like super nervous being like here and like being in the middle and stuff like that. So I don't know if I'm making sense or not. So basically, yeah, me being 26 now and moving to Berlin, I've been here for 7 months. And yeah, so now basically me being here, now I'm exposed to whatever it's called like club culture. Because back in the days when I was living in Dubai my whole life, there was like no such a thing. So now me being here is like experiencing club culture. But most of it was just like internet, me producing music and being on the internet. That was basically me being into the club culture. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. And Fenna, you next.
Well, my name is Fenna De Jong, and I'm from Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And my connection with clubbing is I'm a co-founder of Clau Collective, which is a queer and BPOC club night in Rotterdam and in the Netherlands. And I think that's where my connection is.
I think that's really key here before we get into getting into these different perspectives is that Gen Z is the fastest growing generation, about 30% of the global population. A lot of people will describe this generation as very technologically savvy, very ethnically diverse, socially responsible, and even, dare I say, materialistic. But because this is the fastest growing generation, I think that there's been a lot of interest from whether it's larger companies, whether it's brands, or within specific subcultures themselves to try to capture the attention of Gen Z, especially because in order for maybe electronic music scenes or experimental music scenes or club culture to survive, it has to be something that appeals to generations time and time again. So that's why it's so key that we're having this panel discussion. And I think that Hussein, you kind of talked about it a little bit and saying that, yes, you're involved in club culture. And then you kind of talked about your entry into it when you were 19 listening to Aphex Twin. But I actually wanted to ask everyone about that question. So everyone is doing certain things right now, but Altay, for example, what was your first entry into, like, was there a moment when you realized that this is something that you really wanted to pursue? Because there's a difference between obviously just, going to a night, DJing on the side or something like that, and actually being like, I want to be part of this world.
Yeah, I think there definitely was a turning point. I am quite similar with the aspect with his experience in Dubai. When I was in Turkey, any kind of clubbing events were very popular. And when I first came here and found out these subcultures of electronic music and all these different genres of music that exist, and what unite these people from this music and to the freedom of expression that you can have during one night, and how you can express these types of gatherings in many different ways. I felt at that point, I felt like I wanted to be a part of it because it turned from going out and having fun to having some sort of purpose.
I see. That's a interesting perspective to take. And I'm wondering if anyone else on the stage right now also had that perspective of when was there a point in your career into nightlife when you evolved from just being a patron into being someone who wanted to actively be a part of it? Eugene, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, I think it just came from a frustration because there was a specific scene developing in on SoundCloud and YouTube in the mid 2010s that in London was actually really hard to find, and it was something that me and my friends were really into, and just out of that, like there was a necessity for us to put on our own events and become a kind of collective, just because we weren't hearing those sounds anywhere else, and yeah, I think it was a very natural thing from just like listening to that music and not even knowing that it was part of club culture really, and then wanting to play it with other people and enjoy it with other people. And it just naturally evolved from there. And to be honest, it's like there was never a point where I thought I'm involved in this. It just started out with like, oh, I'm gonna do a flyer for this party, or we're gonna do a T-shirt for this thing, or whatever. There was no conscious point of stepping in.
And Hussein, what about you?
So I mean, again, like I was always into like music like my whole life, but what made me actually like be into it and like actually be part of like the club culture is basically was like the lack of not having any kind of like, let's say like experimental club music in Dubai. So back in 2016, 2017, this is when like I started pushing like the sounds of, again, like experimental club music in a place where no music, this kind of music exists. So it was basically just existing on the internet that's outside of like the region. And basically me and a couple of my friends, we started like just doing parties and stuff like that. Then we just did it for like a couple of months, or like, yeah, something like that, a couple of months, and we completely just stopped it. And again, 2020, this is when like the pandemic hit, and me and my best friend were like I collaborate with, I started like okay, now I need to be part of like that culture somehow. I'm pushing my sounds to like into the like, again, experimental club music. So it was never like real life. It was only like virtual. So this is basically like me how I got like, yeah. So it was just like mostly like internet, nothing real life. So
I guess that's kind of, it goes back to kind of like the tech savvy aspect that you're organizing, or I mean, I think that there's one kind of trend that people always talk about with Gen Z, which is like in terms of their interest, they're very good at organizing online. And so it kind of speaks to your point. But I was curious about your perspective, Fenna, and how was there a turning point for you when you transformed from just a patron to someone who was organizing your own BIPOC and queer nights?
Yeah, for me, I think there was a very direct turning point, because in Rotterdam you used to have just a small queer nightlife. It wasn't much. There was one party, and it was called the Gender Banning Queer Party, and that was once every 3 months. And I think that was, for me, it was my first club experience ever, also my first queer club experience ever, and it really changed my perspective on how to organize a club night with that much intention, and give everyone in that space the feeling that they gave me, and that inspired me a lot. So I think it was 2018, the co-founder of Gender Banning Queer Party decided to call it quits because of hard work. And then there was nothing, and on the last party they announced like, okay, someone needs to keep on doing this. And I was there with 4 of my friends or 5 of my friends, and we were like in different corners looking at each other like, okay, this is us, because this is what we need, and we want to keep on doing this for other people, and give them what we got out of the Gender Banning Queer Party. So there was a very, I think we even know the date that we had this idea, and from that moment on we just started planning for 6 months, and then we had our first party, and that was the start of everything.
I see. It seems like a lot of the things that you all have been discussing is something that really comes out a relatively like natural progression. Like there's something that a space that needs to be filled, and of course you and your friends just decide to organize and fill in that space. Was there a certain obstacle? Because I know now, Altay, you're in Berlin now,
Yeah.
and then Hussein, you're also in Berlin. So were there certain obstacles to throwing your events or something that eventually made you move somewhere else that is quite established for its club culture? I don't know who wants to answer first.
You can go. Go ahead.
Okay, I can go first. So basically, like, what made me like move here? It was mostly like, I mean, the obstacle. It was again like Dubai. People are not really like open-minded to new music, like new sounds, and so again, that's why I stayed like virtually. I was never like in real life. So that's why I was like, okay, I need to like actually like make a real life thing, and that's why I basically like decided to move here. So yeah.
And what about you, Altay?
I think one of the most important is I'm married, and it was a joint decision of ours to move into a country where we could possibly earn more money and we have more opportunities because Budapest is not such a big city, and we hit the roof quite fast. And also, my wife in her respected field, she came to a point where you can't really improve much more, and and it. I felt like we hit some barriers, and I felt no longer so happy in Budapest. So I think it's more of a personal reason and why we came to the city rather than strictly a club culture.
But speaking of different obstacles, that's another thing that I wanted to kind of touch upon as well, which is the fact that, there's all these things like not having open-minded individuals in your own city that would embrace club culture, or you're hitting a certain ceiling and what you're able to do in the places that you're from. I think that a lot of people really view the pandemic as something that specifically hit Gen Z in a way that it didn't really hit other people. There were certain milestones that they weren't able to achieve. I know that like in terms of, certain graduations or like certain big moments were essentially taken away from your generation, or very formative moments that people often look back on. And it's during this very like important time when people are forming their identities, or people are developing their interests, people are developing their communities, that kind of critical point was disrupted due to the pandemic. Did you feel at all, maybe let's start with Eugene, that in the midst of you kind of organizing everything for your career within club culture, that it was disrupted in any kind of way, as opposed to in a higher degree than other generations?
Well, a lot of the stuff that we were doing that I mentioned before, like as in putting on parties with friends and stuff, that actually got ended by everyone kind of going off to different, whatever pursuit it was in their life, going to university or getting a job or whatever. That kind of killed off that as something we could do, because the whole thing was kind of dependent on getting as many of our friends together in one space. So it was really a slightly different thing. Like the pandemic, shortly before that, I'd started working with Peggy shortly before that, and I was actually kind of relieved because like it was a lot of traveling before that, and I was quite tired, and so like having the chance to get some rest during it was good. But it was very disruptive, like it made me had to completely change my practice. Originally, before, I was very focused on photography and videography and doing that within music and club culture, and I had to completely remove that aspect of my practice and shift to design entirely because of the fact that there were no people to film or no people to take photos of. And so yeah, it was disruptive, but actually, I think really useful in how it forced me and a lot of people I know to adapt.
I really like that perspective. I think that oftentimes people are always characterizing this certain narrative in media as it being something that is incredibly disruptive in a way that is only negative. But I mean, given your perspective, you're saying that, you know, there's certain ways that you adapted to it that made you more resilient. And I'm wondering if maybe Fenna, are there ways that you that the pandemic changed your formation of identity or your career development as a member of Gen Z?
Yes, because at first it was of course very disruptive because we do a lot of events, and I like to host events and make spaces where people feel safe and can meet each other and talk, and the pandemic made that kind of impossible. So what we saw was a lot of online spaces being created, and for us it was just we couldn't really, I felt so disconnected with the digital world because there was just so much that I really felt the need for something tangible. And so I think if we started a magazine, Cloud Magazine, after that, which gave us the opportunity to work with so many artists, photographers, writers, everything, and we had like small events around that, so that really created a new opportunity for us to create platform in a different way, and it really taught us a lot of other things that I think we shouldn't have known if the pandemic wasn't there, and also a lot of new people got to know us because we now have this new way of communicating. So it was very disruptive, but it also brought some good things for us.
And what about you, Hussein?
So I mean, I have like a different like view from like everyone else here. I actually the pandemic actually didn't. What actually made me more productive, because I was like always going out. I was just like hanging out, whatever. And when the pandemic hit, we had like really like bad lockdown, like because also like there was no, it's not a walking city, so we can't really just go out and sit in the park or whatever. So that made me actually stay home and like focus on what I do mostly, like music. Literally, just like I was just doing music 24/7. Like my sleeping just went really bad, so I was just like up all night just making music. So it actually made me more productive. So this is how like I started getting like more attention online throughout my music just because of the lockdown. So yeah, it didn't really affect me that much. It actually more productive. That's it. So.
I'm enjoying how positive everyone is, especially because during like all these studies or like all the research that I've done, so many people are always talking about like this overwhelming cynicism around Gen Z. And I'm appreciating the fact that having this conversation, it seems like we're kind of overturning some of the stereotypes that you see written about online. But Altay, I don't know if you have anything to add about your experience during the pandemic too.
I think my experience was quite similar to Eugene's. It kind of forced me into a different field of creativeness. I went back to Turkey, and it was a really bad time, and I just wanted to do something creative. So me and my partner, we started a label that became quite successful, and thanks to that, I became very productive in this field and learned the ins and outs on how to run a label. So I think there were some positive aspects, but I also would like to say, I think the cynicism and everything can be quite fluid. I think every person can go through many phases, and
Yeah.
just specifying a generation towards a word like that is maybe not the right way of doing it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's funny. It's funny that you're saying that, especially because my next question is just like all the research that I've done leading up to this panel. It's just like talking about how your generation is cynical because of chronic uncertainty in the most formative years of your life. Everyone's talking about impending climate catastrophe, the pandemic, things that are being taken away from you, and it's kind of overwhelming. And so like, you know, going into prepping for this panel, I was like, oh man, like we're gonna get into some really tough topics. There's always the topic of mental health as well, which we're gonna touch upon a little bit later. But I mean, going to what you're saying, Altay, in terms of your opinion and observations, how, I guess you would go against the generalization that your generation is cynical. Do you see like you said, it's like the cynicism is fluid. Does anyone else on the stage or yourself think that your generation is cynical? Is it hard to comment on your generation as a whole because it's obviously so big?
Yeah, I feel like I feel like it's very difficult to paint a whole picture of an entire generation. Like there's so many people, right? And so many different places too. I feel like it's different across different parts of the world. Like in China, you had like the Tangping movement, and I think that is very, very different maybe to what's happening in London in terms of like how people are feeling. So I feel like it's not really fair to like paint one big sort of brushstroke of what our generation is about. But what I do feel about just on the topic of like the pandemic and this idea of like pandemic induced cynicism, I feel like it didn't introduce cynicism, it introduced like a kind of anti-fragile attitude to things where I think it was like to me, the pandemic meant that like I understood that this is going to happen again in the future. There's going to be more disruptive events. There's going to be more things that, you know, put the world on pause for a year or a few months or 2 years or 5 years. We don't know, but like that uncertainty is kind of built into like, I feel like I'll speak for myself, like my logic system of like how I sort of understand the future. And so to me, it's like you can find like pessimism in that if you want, or you can find optimism in the fact that you know, if you really work with very little and you're really able to survive these great disruptions, you can do a lot. And I think there's a lot of optimism to be found within that. You know, I had to sell like most of the stuff I own, most of the equipment I had, and just use a laptop when the pandemic happened, and managed to build a studio out of that. And I think like that's very testament to like the attitude of our generation. Is like do a lot with very little, and there's a lot of like joy to be found in that.
Wow, very well put. I appreciate that. Altay, you had a few opinions as well.
No. I think Eugene described it very well.
Does anyone else have anything to say on the stage, Hussein or Fenna?
I agree with Eugene on this, and I think for me personally, within my community, I also see some positive change, some things that I see as positive, because there are more people people of my generation taking matter into their own hands, so they're not waiting for some big government to help them, but they start GoFundMes for friends, and they host smaller events to get people together. And I don't know, I also see some sort of unity within this mess that we're in or something. So it's, yeah.
Hussein?
So, like, I share the same opinion like as them, but I just want, yeah. So, again, like, I can't really speak about like Gen Zs or like, because like I mostly talk about like my generation somehow, because like I'm on the cusp of like being like a millennial. So, so yeah, actually, like, again, like the same thing. It's more like the generation of like Generation Z actually shows more unity to the community, or like any type of like community that's like struggling, they would like help them out. And yeah, it's like basically I share the same opinion. So yeah.
I was actually a little bit curious, Eugene. You're talking about the Tanping movement and then what's going on in London. I was wondering if you could clarify for audience members if perhaps they don't really know the references that you just talked about.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really interesting. The Tang Ping movement is, I think it's directly translates to lying flat, and it's like this attitude towards, I guess, like work-life balance in China, and this pressure to constantly work and to pursue these ideals for how you should live your life and what you should aspire to. And essentially, a lot of young people in China have started to reject those values and I guess see it as kind of aspirational or a sort of more idealistic way of living to almost like not work as hard and to reject capitalism, reject extreme materialist values, and just to live very simple lives. And I think like I think there's something really interesting there about that, and then the parallels you can draw between like quiet quitting in America and how a lot of those things are actually very similar in that they're ultimately like rejections of this image that is sold to you when you're like younger of having a house paid off with a family and a stable job, and there's this real rejection of that now. I think London is sort of similar, but I can't speak for an entire city.
Mhm. I mean, the parallels that you're drawing between that movement and quiet quitting, that's actually really interesting to me because I feel as though one of the things that millennials are kind of known for, the generation above yours, is like constantly working themselves to death. And I think that there's definitely some kind of, maybe because of the disruptions and maybe because of all these kinds of things that are going on, like you were saying, Eugene, about learning that you have to do with what you can, even if you have or are given really little and you're born into a circumstance that's not very optimal, to actually, yeah, just to adapt and to figure out ways to go against the status quo, perhaps, that is already established. So speaking of status quo, I don't think it's always important to get into a conversation about social media because that's directly connected to a lot of these discussions around your generation and Gen Z as well. But clearly, all of you are very immersed in this world. I actually did note that, Fenna, you said that you felt a little bit disconnected from the digital world, even though a lot of people will characterize Gen Z as very much digitally connected. But all of you are immersed in this club culture world. But many of the individuals in your generation, their introduction to rave and club culture comes through an almost commodified and flattened depiction of social media. Namely, I think that we can all point to techno TikTok with its dance tutorials, or it's how to get into Berghain viral memes, or the rave aesthetics search on Pinterest. So Instagram and Pinterest all believe that this year is the year of the rave, just given everyone's interest in trying to figure out rave culture and get their mind around rave culture. Does anyone have an opinion about this? And I'm curious about what you think and how you perceive these kind of social media movements.
Should I start?
Yes.
All right. I think trends like these have always existed, not just in our generation, but previous generations as well. But it feels like it's 10 times more heavy due to the effect of social media. And I hope like consumers are able to distinguish the emptiness of this. And I could say, in my perspective, I don't think this year is the year of the rave. And I feel like I have a unique perspective on this because Budapest is a much smaller city, and in a city like Berlin, you can find anything that you want, and so when a smaller city like Budapest, you don't have so many clubs and you don't have so many things like this. A smaller city definitely more focuses on the trendier aspects because most of the population, I guess, they think it's because it's trendy, and I feel like this pushes a lot of young kids who are like into techno, putting a basically a fake personality and a fake persona to align themselves with the current trends that are going on. Yeah. So that's what I felt like I observed in Budapest.
So it's a little bit about, so I feel like club culture, a lot of people talk about community, they talk about unity, they talk about especially like BIPOC and queer liberation. But when someone kind of goes on a movement that is just trendy and doesn't have any of that context, a lot of the important ties and the roots get lost. But
for sure.
Yeah, does anyone else on the stage have any immediate opinions about techno, TikTok, and social media in the ways that we just discussed?
I feel like it's like the way I see it is like it's all part of an ecosystem. Like the most like intimate and energetic experience at a club and a 6-second TikTok are kind of like on either end of like a funnel. And the funnel at the wide end is like the surface level TikTok stuff that we see. And I feel like for a lot of us who are like deeply involved in the culture, we can look at the stuff at the top of the funnel and feel a bit alienated from it because it doesn't contain a lot of the context. It doesn't contain a lot of the history of like where a lot of this stuff came from, the communities that built it. But I think we can't be too jaded by that because it's like you need that top of the funnel to engage people who wouldn't be engaged otherwise. Like, yes, I think if you consistently consume the surface content, then you will gain a really warped picture of club culture and what it means. But for a lot of kids, like as we've all said, like it starts out for a lot of kids with like engagement with media online, and you become more and more curious about something and you discover more things, and next thing you know you're in a club and having that really immersive experience. And I think it's like it's asking a bit much for like the TikTok people and the people making 6-second reels to talk about Derek May or talk about Frankie Knuckles, or it's like it's asking too much. It's like trying to teach a kid about politics when they need to learn the alphabet first. You need this like spectrum, this balance. Yeah.
That's a very good take. Does anyone else have something that they would like to add?
Actually, yeah. So I basically share this like the same opinion because for me being part of like just like watching like TikToks and stuff like that, it's kind of funny to me like looking back in the bio, like looking at these videos. I'm like, oh, this is like it's almost impossible to like get into Berghain and stuff like that, and people wear like the craziest outfits just to get in. So yeah, then coming to Berlin after like looking at these videos, it made me like actually change the perspective. I'm like, I just went standing in front of Berghain just like wearing shorts, and like I got in, I was like, okay, what is going on like this kind of like TikToks. So it actually teaches people like nothing, but it actually teaches people like a lot of things about like actually try it out. Maybe you're gonna be into this kind of culture. Maybe it's gonna teach you how to like look at this kind of things like differently, or like it's gonna teach you like how to listen to music differently or whatever. Like because like TikTok like teaches you like the weirdest things ever. But yeah, I'm actually super into it. I love it. So
amazing. Fenna, what's your take?
Yeah, I really share that opinion, and I think TikTok is also part of the new generation, and it's their language. And I think, yeah, I mean, there's two sides of it, of course, but I mean, I have to say, I also kind of like it that when you're in a club and they play one certain song and the half of the room knows how to dance to that song. It's also kind of funny. I don't know. Yeah. It doesn't really bother me, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's two really amazing points that I kind of wanted to go deeper into. So Eugene, you were talking about this funnel effect and how, yes, when you first enter the culture, it might be an impression that you get on social media. It might make you curious, and then eventually you're able to, maybe you actually go to a club, and then you actually like the DJ, and then it's almost a rabbit hole that you go down. And then you actually are part of the culture in a more substantial way because you're digging into the history somehow. And it kind of reminds me about how everyone kind of has their own starting place. right? Like for some people, when I talk to various colleagues or various people who entered the music scene from like the very, very initial elements, not everyone starts out listening to Aphex Twin. Not everyone starts out listening to someone who is, I guess, like really within the electronic music or experimental scenes proper, but sometimes it's their journey from EDM, like listening to Skrillex, or it is that social media impression, or it is like coming across a book or something. So everyone has their little ties before they actually get into the scene, fall in love with it, and then make it their own, and then educate themselves around the context. So I think that was a really incredible point. And then I think Hussein, that a point that you made about TikTok and how when you actually went to Berghain, it wasn't what was sold to you on social media. I think that more and more we have to be critical of kind of like the misinformation and the different ways that social media can sell you certain things that seems like shiny and market in a very specific way, but actually isn't that way in real life, and being critical of that perspective. Which leads to my next question. Pretty broad, but what is your own relationship with social media? Is it complicated? Is it critical? Let's start with you, Altay.
I guess my relationship with the social media is like I'm pretty much an iPad kid. I've grown with technology all around me, and at one point when it came to high school, I couldn't really take it anymore, so I stopped using a phone for 4 years, and I guess that also was due to like my own traumatic experiences and like my personal issues. But now I feel like I'm back in the matrix once again, just constantly around stimulation, and yeah. And I really liked taking that like 4 year break of not having a phone, because I would always walk around with my computer, and that huge computer gave me like if I really need to communicate with someone, if it's a important thing I need to check, then I would open my computer and then go onto social media or on messaging apps. And I felt like that made me feel really grounded.
Yeah, I guess it kind of maybe the 4 year break is something that you don't often hear. Like again, like what you were talking about, Fenna, you were saying that you felt disconnected during the pandemic to the digital world. Of course, there's all these narratives around Gen Z, but again, there's like these individual stories about how people have complicated relationships with social media. It's not just like 0 and 1, it's way more complicated. But I'm wondering if you want to go into briefly your own relationship with social media and kind of comment from your perspective.
Yeah, for me, I think it's very complicated because I also work as a brand manager, so I have to work within social media a lot of times, and that also made me a bit repulsive to use it for myself. And like, I don't really post a lot unless I need it for work. So yeah, for me, I think when I was younger, it was very different, but now I see social media more as a tool that I work with than something that I use for myself. But I also am a big fan of TikTok, and that is something I do. I can scroll for hours, to be honest, so yeah, it's complicated.
And what about you, Hussein?
I mean, I don't know, like I always like grew up like using the internet, like the dial internet, and like my mom always used to shout at me like, oh, like someone is calling me or whatever, and like so I had to remove it. So but yeah, so like I always like grew up on the internet, just like MSN and like this kind of stuff. So yeah, like I hated it for like a while because like I actually wanted just to go out and like experience, because again, Dubai kid, so I was never outside. I come back from school, stay home, MSN, sleep, school. It was always like that. So yeah, it was always the internet for me. YouTube, that's it. Like now, like as an adult, it's just SoundCloud, music, online. That's it, basically. So yeah.
And you, Eugene?
Well, I think social media is really difficult to grow up with, especially, for me, like I was like running YouTube channels and doing all kinds of like things. I've always had, essentially since the age of like 12 or 13, always had some degree of public presence online. And I think that's really dangerous in a lot of ways because, these dopamine loops can almost create these reward systems that shape your personality without you really having any control over that. And I think that can be a really dangerous spiral, especially when I think nowadays a lot of social media rewards people being vulnerable, extremely vulnerable online, and like it enables those kind of parasocial relationships. So I think like it's always been tough, but I think the way I've always like developed a healthy relationship with social media has been through like really finding purpose outside of it first and bringing that purpose to what I communicate on social media, I think. So that I'm less vulnerable to like, the algorithm like manipulating me and pushing me in directions I don't want to go in.
Could you describe a little bit about the purpose that you find outside and then what you bring into social media? I'm curious about that point.
Yeah, I think it comes from like developing a social experience outside of it, and I think that's really crucial. Like I think when your social experience and when your sense of community is derived entirely from social media, I think it becomes very alienating because you're purely seeing the idealized versions of people, but also like you're not really getting access to what's really happening. You're seeing things as they are finished or as they're complete. Whereas if you build a community of people where you might be meeting with them in real life physically, or whether it's group chats or whatever, that becomes a way to actually be a lot more experimental with what you're sharing with people and communicating with people, such that you have something to say when you actually say it to a much wider audience.
I also was curious about that point that you made about being pushed around by the algorithm. I think that there's a lot of hand wringing from older generations over statistics that we see, specifically tied to social media and also anxiety and depression. Obviously, when you, like you said, Altay, you grew up like an iPad kid, and then there was a certain point when you were like, I no longer want to engage with technology in this way, and you took a 4-year break. There's a lot that will push you to make that kind of decision. And so a lot of these discussions around Gen Z, around anxiety, depression, compulsive behavior, many of these stats relate back to your generation's usage of social media. So less time spent building key social relationships in real life or exploring your identity in ways that aren't, like you said, Eugene, in a public forum. Have you observed these struggles in your peers or even within yourself, specifically around mental health? And do you think that club culture, which offers a sense of community and identity as a way to mitigate some of those difficulties? Maybe let's start with Altay.
I think definitely I could. I don't know. I don't have a broad information on many other people. I could only speak from my own experience. Clubbing, definitely, when I did not know how to deal with my own problems and did not understand the scope of the issues that I was dealt with, it definitely helped me in a temporary space to. It was quite therapeutic, I would say, but I would never say that that is a solution to your problems. I think it's probably a nice gateway to help you, but afterwards I started to learn how to deal with my own problems without clubbing or of course taking drugs, which is heavily connected with the club scene in many countries.
Maybe just maybe music as being a therapeutic, maybe not club culture, but
yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, let's go to the stage. Fenna, do you have anything to say about the connection between social media use and mental health, and potentially having club culture or music as a way to, to mitigate some of those detrimental effects.
Yeah, I think social media use and mental health is different for everyone, because I can of course see situations where your social media use is bad for your mental health, or it's not helping you getting in directions you want to. But I also see, coming from a small town in the Netherlands, with no other queer people, the internet and social media was actually very helpful for me, and it gave me a lot of new connections and new friends. So I think it's different for everyone, and yeah, I think social media it can also be, I don't want to say helpful, but it can be a tool, and that's the same with the clubbing. I think coming together with like-minded people is really good for, yeah, connecting with people is really good, and I think that clubbing and especially bringing people together can really help certain people, but not for everyone. I think it's just a tool. Yeah, you have to do a lot of stuff, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Do either of you have any points that you would like to discuss as well?
So again, I was just like wanted to point out some people, like for me, how I deal. Again, I'm gonna talk about like my personal experience. How I dealt with like my mental health was basically not going out, because again, Dubai. I always point out Dubai because there was like nothing. It was mostly like music for me, just like just creating music, putting all my anger or like my emotions throughout music. So if I'm having a bad day, I'll just like spend the whole day just making music, just like spending the whole day making music. So this is how I dealt with it again, and like this is how I still deal with it. So yeah.
So you're talking more about how you're sublimating any kind of negative emotions that you have into a creativity itself, and music as the ultimate kind of therapy, as opposed to club culture itself, which, like you said, Altay, can come with a host of other kind of behaviors that are not as beneficial to your mental health. Eugene, do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of like our generation's issues, or like the like real challenge, the tension in our generation is between speed and depth, where I feel like we are really like adept at discovering things at really quick speeds and adopting trends and identities at really fast speeds. But what we're not so good at is depth, and finding depth in our experiences and our relationships. I really feel that now with like the way that everything is so transient, whether that's like where you decide to live or like who you decide to build relationships with, because we are so aware of everything everywhere happening all the time. It's like very hard to build any kind of depth, and I feel like club culture specifically is one of the ways in which we can do that, where I think club culture has this discoverable layer in the form of like social media and what you find there and what you find on YouTube or on TikTok or within different music scenes. But you can go deeper into some really immersive and important experiences. And I think there's a broader context to that. Sorry if I'm speaking too much, but like with like us losing potentially offices in our lives, like with remote work, and losing a lot of like the presence of religion and all these other things that once brought a lot of like intimate, deep, like communal experiences. There's a real void to be filled, where like club culture is kind of one of the few things left that like, where young people gather. And I think that like makes it probably more important than we want to think about, I guess.
No, that's such a good point. I was actually reading recently that now that religions are more secular, you have a loss of like religious spaces. You have a loss of places where people can actually commune. So people used to gather at church, people used to gather at certain like Elks clubs or like recreational clubs. And as those have gone away, people are feeling even more atomized by society and even more atomized through social media use and viewing everyone's idealized versions of themselves. And there's an epidemic of loneliness going on as well. And so, as you said, club culture is truly one of the last places where people can gather and truly be themselves in whatever way that kind of takes shape. And that's why the threat of these spaces being lost is so great to, I guess, like its impact on greater society. But yes, there's actually there's one question from the audience that I'm just going to cut in. So I have a couple more questions, but it seems right to put it and pose it to the group. What is your take on rebellious counter movements like the illegal raves that happened during the pandemic in Berlin? More specifically, regarding the tension between people following COVID restrictions and the others who completely declined these in your generation. Does anyone want to jump in on it?
I'm not from Berlin, so you should talk about it.
I'm also like, and I didn't live in Berlin during COVID, so I don't know how it was, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think Fenna, you're from Rotterdam, and then Altay, I think you moved here 7 months ago.
Okay. No, I moved here a week ago.
Oh, you moved here a week ago. Oh my god.
Yeah. I mean,
okay,
we had similar situations in Rotterdam. We also had a lot of illegal get-togethers, and I think it was very interesting to see, because this was also a generation that has never been to a club before or never interacted with like substances and drugs within this spaces. So for them to start doing that at house parties and unprotected places. I don't know how I can explain that, but that was something we saw when we started the club life, the nightlife again. We saw a lot of abuse of substances, and I think that the illegal raves were good for some, because if we can't see each other at all and we get depressed, that's also a bad thing. So I'm sorry.
no, not at all.
But what I wanted to say was, like, we had restrictions, but a lot of people were around me were like really getting depressed. Like they really needed to have a sort of outlet. And I mean, it's not good, but I think that it's okay that sometimes there happen illegal parties. But it was kind of crazy at some points, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And thank you for whoever asked that question. We're going to wrap it up in about, I guess, less than 10 minutes, but I think that it's really key that we finish off on one last question, if we can kind of zoom through it. So in my research about Gen Z, I found that obviously it's the most diverse generation yet, and with a great emphasis on allowing sexual and gender fluidity, with a majority of them identifying as not heterosexual, not cisgender, and not rigidly masculine or feminine. There's also an emphasis on protecting the rights of the marginalized. And club culture is also known for having these similar values and characteristics. And I guess my question is, did you feel at home in this culture given the characteristics? And how can club culture better incorporate Gen Z into its spheres? Let's start with Eugene.
God, it's a tough one.
It's a big question. Yeah.
I think, well, so in terms of like how club culture can start to incorporate more people from our generation, I think it's difficult because it kind of seems to be an issue with like real estate and issues with the police that are making it very difficult to like actually run clubs, especially in London. But I think, you know, in a way, the pandemic illegal raves are like an example of how much it's just an inherently human thing to want to gather and play music, right? And so I feel like with our generation, it's going to happen in probably ways we can't predict right now because there's a whole new playing field. I think one interesting thing that I've been hearing recently is like this phrase, zero interest rate phenomenon, which is like a way to describe most things from the last 10 or 20 years as a result of like the government printing money. And now we're in a completely different like economic situation, which kind of means that like it's a whole new playbook to be written. And I think, I mean, the thing that interests me the most right now specifically is how I think that most people in like 10 years will be DJs, and DJing will almost be like a embedded act, like cooking or something like that. And I think that's a serious thing. Like it's going to change the way we listen to music. And I think from that, there'll be entirely new dimensions of how we socialize, how we build community, how we build our identities within that. I think we can't see it right now, but it's going to be different to what has existed before. And I think if there's one thing, it's just that the incumbent people within club culture, they just need to be open to that and receptive to it.
So it's extending a certain open-mindedness. I really like the fact that you're saying that, you know, maybe DJing is going to be like cooking, because you do see a lot of people, it becomes very socialized. Fenna, do you have anything to say about it?
Well, I kind of agree with Eugene, and yeah, I think it's very fluid, and I'm also curious to see in which ways we will go. I think we really saw a lot of things changing in the past couple of years really fast, and I think, I mean, there's also bad things going on, but there's also some really good perspectives coming out of this, I think, which, such as you said, just, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Hussein or Altay, would you like to make any comments before we wrap things up?
I think I'm okay.
Okay, cool. Wait, did you say something, Hussein? I can't really hear you.
Oh yeah. Oh, should I go or should he go?
Yes. Yeah. No. Please go. Altay is good. He's good on it.
I think. Okay. So the question was about like gender and.
No. I mean, well, let me just reframe it.
Okay.
So I guess like we can just go to the question: how can club culture better incorporate Gen Z into its spheres? Because I think there's certain characteristics and values that club culture and Gen Z are very aligned on. But yeah, how can it be more inclusive, for lack of a better word?
I mean, again, like the door policies of all the clubs in the world should change, so they can like basically like include all the generations, because sometimes you will see someone that doesn't dress a certain way or like looks a different way. They'll be like, oh, this guy doesn't belong here. So yeah, this is basically my take for that. I don't know if it makes sense, but it makes sense in my head. So sometimes like what I say, it doesn't make sense, but it makes sense in my head. So yeah.
No, it does make sense. Thank you for that. I think that, like, as you're saying, there should be inclusivity not only in the people who are allowed to become DJs and democratizing, maybe using technology as a tool to democratize electronic music and club culture, but also reflecting that in door policies so it becomes more inclusive and just intentional. So we're at 6:19, and this is the conclusion of Under 25. Clubbing and Gen Z. I want to say thank you to everyone who joined me. Thank you, Altay. Thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Fenna. And thank you, Hussein. I hope the audience was interested and engaged in this discussion. And yeah, thank you so much for being with us. Take care, everyone.